Hi there, my name is Ron Rogers, and this presentation is titled Flying with a Challenger Commander, Dick Scobee, out at Edwards Air Force Base. Now, Edwards Air Force Base was a really neat place to fly, especially back in the late 70s. Well, it's probably always been a neat place to fly, and it probably continues to be a neat place to fly, but I was out there in the late 70s, and it was a fun time. Now, the thing about Edwards is you were able to associate with a lot of neat people. And I'm talking about aviation legends down to people who would become aviation legends. Now, this was from the Desert Times paper when some of the group out there was selected to be shuttle astronauts. Now, the space shuttle in the late 70s was a brand new program. We were doing the approach and landing tests out there, and it hadn't flown in space yet. Now, I had a chance to fly with Dick Scobee and a number of the shuttle astronauts, or people who would become shuttle astronauts, in the very initial group. Now, and of course, the picture we've got Dick Scobee here and Ellison Onizuka, who unfortunately, of course, were on the Challenger. Onizuka had his office just down the hallway from mine in the test pilot school. Stanivel, which I ended up being in out at Edwards, is the senior flight examiner in the Air Force Flight Test Center. Our office just happened to be in the test pilot school. And some of the people, like Lauren Shriver, who flew the fourth mission of the shuttle, he had an interesting story talking about, they've been through all the training. They're sitting there on the stack, and the liquids light up, and it does a thing called a twang. It pushes the whole structure about 1.8 feet, and then it comes back to vertical to solids fire. And he was telling me, I think at the bar one day, that he's sitting there and he feels the shuttle move, and he's going, was that liftoff? And he says, no, when the solids lit, he says, it wasn't a liftoff like you typically saw with the rockets. He says, you were blasted off of the pad. He says, there was no doubt in your mind you were going. And one of the other guys that was kind of interesting to meet is Brewster Shaw, when you see in the picture there. I don't think Brewster ended up being number two in anything he did. I mean, a very humble individual, a cool guy. It was the other people who told me about his accomplishments, but just a cool guy. And my son and I, my oldest son, Mark, at the time, we didn't have we only had Lori, our youngest daughter. Didn't have my youngest son at the time, but we had Mark, and Mark and I were down at McDonald's in Lancaster, a city near Edwards there that a lot of people who worked on the base lived at. And Brewster Shaw and his son came in. And we said hello, and we chatted just a little bit, and we both had our little lunches there. And as Brewster Shaw and his son left, I said to my son, Mark, I said, he's just been selected as a space shuttle astronaut. He goes, cool. Well, years later, I'm out of the Air Force. I'm working as an airline pilot. And this was back when on national news, they broadcast the space shuttle launches live before they became more routine. But they broadcast them live. And my son was laying on the floor watching the countdown. And I said to him, I said, remember that guy that we met in at McDonald's with his son, and I told you he was selected to be a space shuttle astronaut? And Mark says, yeah, I remember that. And I said, that's him in command of the mission there. And he goes, cool. Now, Dick was an interesting guy. He started out in the Air Force as an enlisted man. He was a reciprocating engine mechanic assigned to Kelly Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas, and San Antonio is a great city to live in, and especially if you're in the Air Force. And he was assigned to that. Well, in his spare time, he got his college degree, got selected for Air Force pilot training, went to Vietnam, and came back, went to the test pilot school, and then one of his early assignments was involved with the X-24B lifting body program. Now, this program was a precursor to the space shuttle, getting a lot of the information on lifting bodies that they used to design the space shuttle. But this was kind of one of his major programs, and when I knew him, he had an advanced man vehicle patch on him. He was kind of the guy in charge of the advanced man vehicle programs. And there's Dick in the center with the Air Force cap on, and some of the other very interesting individuals also involved in this program. You may actually recognize some of them. But Dick was a cool guy. There was quite a pecking order out at Edwards, and the guys who were really senior and were secure in their positions, they treated the new guys pretty nicely. Some of the people that were more your contemporaries, and Dick was still quite a bit senior to being one of my contemporaries, but the guys who were your contemporaries, they didn't treat you the best. You were competition, but Dick, and I don't know if it's because he came through the enlisted ranks or what, but he was really nice to me. Now, I got checked out in the T-38 out at Edwards, and I was a regular pilot, and they had a request for people who'd done functional check flights. Now, in the training command, if you wanted to be a functional check pilot, an FCF pilot, you had to go through a month-long training school, and then you were certified to do this, and this was your main job. Well, they needed people to do FCFs, and I happened to be talking to one of the other pilots in there named Vince, and I mentioned, boy, I'd like to fly FCF, but I've never flown FCF. And he goes, oh, sure you have. And I go, no, Vince, I've never flown. He goes, no, you don't understand. That's not the question. If they've asked you if you've flown it before, tell them you've flown it, but you need a little bit refreshment to get back in the groove. So okay, well, Edwards was a place that doesn't suffer fools gladly. You rose up, you took the challenge, or you kind of got left behind. So I said, okay, I'll give it a try. What do I have to lose? Well, I got my FCF checkout. I got the books. I read through them very thoroughly, and that's one thing I could do very well was read and absorb manuals and virtually memorize them. So I had the manual down, and I went out on a introductory flight, a refresher flight, and we did a full FCF profile, and okay, that's not too bad. So my first introduction to Dick was flying. He did my check ride on the FCF, and it went well, and he signed me off to be an FCF pilot. Now, Dick had a lot of interesting things in his background. He ended up flying the shuttle carrier, the 747. He was an instructor pilot on the 747 and also involved in the C5 program. But before we got to that point, we flew a few test missions together. We flew one that was especially notable because they wanted us to be a moving infrared target. They had a new missile that the F-15 carried, an AIM-9L. They did a captive carry, and what you did was you carried the missile on the fighter, and you had it lock on to you as the test aircraft, and then it acquired all the data and stuff to see how well the seeker head could track it. But they said, okay, we want you to go over Bakersfield, California, and we want you to go low altitude, 500 knots, and do a bunch of 6G turns in burner. And that was kind of interesting because Bakersfield was outside of our test area, and that speed was a little higher than we were supposed to fly, but we looked over the test cards, and they were assigned by the appropriate people, so it was okay. You go fly this, and of course we never heard anything about it, any complaints, but we went over downtown's Bakersfield, Dick and I, and we're at 500 feet, 500 knots, pulling 5-6 Gs in afterburner. And he says, okay, that's good. Go out over the farmer's field. So we go out of the farmer's field, and we do the same thing over there. And he goes, okay, go over the residential areas. I want to get some data over the residential areas. So there we are at 500 feet, 500 knots, in burner, doing high G turns. There's a guy down there mowing his lawn. It was kind of hazy. Not really the best environment to be doing this. But it was kind of the way Edwards operated, at least at the time. I don't know if they can still do things like that today, but at the time, that's how they conducted the missions. And like I said, we had flown a number of missions together, and Dick was selected to be a shuttle astronaut. So one thing he needed before he went into NASA was he needed one last Air Force check ride in the T-38. And by this time, I had become the T-38 senior flight examiner in Stanival. So I gave Dick his last Air Force check ride before he went to NASA. And I remember standing with Dick next to the pop machine in test ops and talking to him about the shuttle, because it's a dangerous vehicle. And I said, are you concerned about that? It's a new vehicle. It's dangerous. And he goes, well, anytime you go more than 10 feet, 10 knots, you're risking your life. And of course, he was well aware of it. He wasn't any fool, but he says, it's a great program. It's the risk you take. It's where I want to be. Now, Dick was a great guy, a great pilot, a lot of fun to be around, a lot of fun to be associated with. When he got selected to be a shuttle astronaut, I was out there drinking various forms of alcoholic beverages with him. And actually, it was the first time I became sick on tequila. Tequila isn't my friend, but we had a good time at the party. And of course, you know how it turns out. He was commander of the ill-fated Challenger mission on January 28th, 1986. Wasn't the first time he flew the Challenger. He actually flew it back on STS-41C back in April 1984. But of course, you're all familiar with this accident. The country lost a really great pilot and a great individual, and of course, the other crew members on board the vehicle. But I just wanted to give you my personal recollections of flying with Dick and what a neat guy he was. Thanks for listening.